Hey, what is going on, guys? RvzStealth here, and in today's video, I'm going to be giving you guys my opinion on the best junglers for patch 5.23. So first up, I have Elise. I think that Elise is still a very strong pick for solo queue, as long as you can play her mechanically. She definitely is a little bit harder to play than some of the other junglers in the game, just because she's got a lot of different combos that she can use, and she also is somewhat skill shot reliant with her cocoon. If you can't land your cocoon when you are ganking with Elise, then your ganks are going to be pretty lackluster. So if you aren't the player who does well on mechanically skilled champions, Elise may not be the best pick for you, but if you can play Elise correctly, she can definitely snowball the early game really hard. So pros to Elise are that she does have great clear speeds in the jungle because she's got the attack speed steroid on her W in spider form, and then she's also got percentage health damage with her Q in spider form. She does have very good ganks as well if you can land her cocoon. And her sustain in the jungle is also quite nice with the passive from her W. She's a really good tower diver too. I think this is the one thing that differentiates like a really good Elise player to an average Elise player. A really good Elise player will look for tower dives, and they will know when to tower dive in the early game as Elise, whereas like an average Elise player, they won't look for tower dives at all. And I think that if you want to play Elise to her highest potential, then you do want to look for tower dives in the early game because she can definitely pull them off really nicely with her repel. She's a pretty good duelist as well. If you can land your cocoon and catch the target out, then you're pretty much guaranteed to win that duel every single time. And she does have a lot of versatility when it comes to build paths. You can go like Rylai's and then full tank on Elise. You can go like full AP Elise. It really just depends on what your team comp needs. And she does have a lot of damage actually if you do end up building her full AP. One con to Elise, like I touched on earlier, is that she's a little bit harder to play than some of the other junglers in the game, in my opinion, because she's got a lot of different combos that she can use, and she's also pretty reliant on landing her cocoon when she does gank. And if you can't do that, then I think there are definitely some easier junglers in the game than her. So next up, I have Lee Sin, and this is like one of the first times I've had Lee Sin on my top 5. I think it's definitely like the first time in a few months, and the reason why he's on my list this patch is because right now, games seem to end like before the 30-minute point. I've had games that end like at the 20-minute point the past few patches, and since the games are really short, I think that Lee Sin is a much stronger pick right now, because if you can snowball the early game as Lee Sin, then you can just end the game before 30 minutes. You can end up picking up the Rift Herald, and then you can just group with your team and push down a lane. So I think that Lee Sin is much stronger now just due to games ending a lot quicker, and then he doesn't really fall off because it doesn't really get to late game as much anymore. So pros to Lee Sin are that he does have a really strong early game. As long as you can get good ganks off in the early game as Lee Sin, then he can be a very successful champion. He's a great duelist as well because he's got the attack speed debuff on his E, so whenever he slams the ground with his E, then the enemy's attack speed is going to be reduced. So he's a really good pick against any champion who does rely on auto attacking. He's also got pretty good clears in the jungle. He's got the AoE damage with his E. He's also got some decent lifesteal with his W, so he stays pretty healthy in the jungle, and he also does clear pretty fast. He does also have really good mobility. I really like the new jungle item on Lee Sin, the one where you can get 2 wards, because it just allows him to stay really mobile. He can just ward jump whenever he really needs to, and I think that it's just much stronger now when you are getting to the mid to late game team fights as well, because I never really liked to pick up Sightstone on Lee Sin, but now that I can like have free wards out of the jungle item, and also, well, you're really not going to have the warding totem because you're going to want to swap that out for the sweeper, but just having the free wards now as Lee Sin will just allow you to insect kick in team fights, and it'll just allow you to stay much more mobile, and you don't have to end up buying that Sightstone. And a few cons to him though is that he is one of the harder junglers in the game, in my opinion, because he's pretty skill shot reliant with his Q when he is ganking, and he does also have like a lot of different combos that he can use. He can like insect kick, he can make some like flash kick plays, and I think that a really good Lee Sin player, there's definitely a big difference from like an average Lee Sin to a really good Lee Sin player. And he is also pretty weak if you do fall behind with him, or if it does go to late game. So next up I have Jax. I think that Jax is like one of the strongest junglers or top laners in the game right now because of the Guinsoo's item. That item is pretty strong right now, and it definitely does synergize with Jax really nicely because he's a hybrid champion, meaning he does AP and AD damage, so that item just works really well with him right now. And if you can get that and the Sated Devourer, you can do so much damage as him, and you can just pretty much duel any other champion in the game once you have those two items. He's got the auto attack reset with his W as well, which it just allows him to clear the jungle a little bit faster than some of the other junglers in the game. Like I said before, he does have mixed damage, so it's really hard to build against a Jax because he's going to be dealing the AP damage with his W, and with his normal auto attacks, he's going to be dealing AD damage, so it's hard for the enemies to build against a Jax, that's for sure. He does also have a very strong late game, and his early game presence is pretty good as well, because he's got the stun on his E, and he also does have the gap closer on his Q. And like I said before, he does do a ton of damage once he gets the Sated Devourer. And one con to Jax though is that he does have a little bit of a weaker first clear because he doesn't have any AoE damage other than his E, and his E's on like a 13-second cooldown at rank 1, so his first clear is definitely a little bit weaker than some of the other junglers since he doesn't have more than like one AoE ability. Next up, I have Rammus. So I think that Rammus is definitely a really good pick in this meta right now because we're seeing a lot of AD champions being played right now. I think definitely we're seeing more AD champions than we have in a long time, that's for sure. And Rammus is like the biggest counter to AD champions because he can just end up building full armor. He can deal a ton of damage because of his passive, and he can also just soak a ton of damage because of the armor he's going to be building. So I think that if the enemy team locks like 2 or 3 AD champions, then definitely look to pick Rammus, especially if they lock someone like a Tryndamere or a Master Yi. Rammus is a great pick against them, so I would recommend picking Rammus definitely if the enemy team does have a potent AD comp. He is also great with like the new masteries. The new tank masteries are really good and they work really well with Rammus. And he's got great ganks in the early game as well. He's got the really good mobility with his Q, which just allows him to gank from a lot of places where other junglers can't. Like, he can gank from the river, and even if the river's warded, he can still pull off a successful gank just because of the speed boost on his Q. He's got pretty strong like CC as well. His Q provides the knock up, and then his E provides like a 2.5 second taunt once you get that maxed out. So what I would recommend doing as Rammus is max your W, or I would recommend putting 3 points into your W actually, and then max out your E, because once you get that 2.5 second taunt, then that just becomes really strong for team fighting, and you can just completely take out a champion in a team fight if you do get that taunt off on them. And a few cons to him though is that he is a little bit weaker if he does fall behind, since he's like an all-in champion, and you want to be in the enemy's faces when you're playing as Rammus, and if you don't have those tank items, then you can't really do that. And he also isn't the best against like a full AP enemy comp, because obviously he's not going to be able to build the armor, and then he's not going to get extra damage out of his passive. So if the enemy team only has like one AD champion like as their AD carry, then picking Rammus may not be the best choice in that situation. And to round out the top 5 for this patch, I have Xin Zhao. So Xin Zhao is just a really strong jungler right now due to the Sated Devourer as well as the Guinsoo's item. That item synergizes really well with him. And by the way, guys, if I've been pronouncing that item wrong, then just correct me in the comments below, because nobody's really ever, like, I've never really built that item before, so I have never really pronounced it, or I've never really heard anybody else pronounce it. So if I am pronouncing it wrong, if it's not Guinsoo's, then just correct me in the comments below. But he's really good with that item because he benefits from the AP from it. He'll get the extra health back from his W, because his W scales with AP, so he's going to be getting more health back every third auto attack, which just makes him a really strong duelist. And if you end up building like Blade of the Ruined King on Xin Zhao, then you're going to be getting a lot of life back when you are like in the jungle, or when you're in a team fight or dueling an opponent. And he is also a very healthy jungler just due to his W. I find myself not usually having to run through all of my potions in the jungle as Xin Zhao, which is just really nice, because then you don't have to like buy extra potions whenever you do go to base. He's got great CC as well. His Q provides the knock up on the third attack. His E provides a pretty nice slow, and then his ultimate gets the knockback, so his CC is definitely, I think, one of the most underrated parts of his kit. He's strong at all stages of the game as well. He's a great duelist, and the gap closer on his E just allows him to gank really effectively. And there aren't really too many cons to Xin Zhao right now, in my opinion, but I guess if his E is on cooldown, like if you use your E to gap close to an opponent and you don't end up like getting the knockup off on them, then they can just end up kiting you since he doesn't have any other sort of gap closer. But that's not really like the biggest con in the world because he's got the gap closer in the first place, and some of the other champions in the game don't even have gap closers, so I don't think there are very many cons to Xin Zhao. Let me know in the comments below actually, guys, if you think that there are like a few other cons to him, because I can't really come up with too many good ones right now because I just think that he's a really strong jungler. And first up on the honorable mentions, I have Rengar. So Rengar is a pretty good pick as long as you can get good ganks off once you hit level 6 as him. His pre-6 ganks are alright. They're not the best, but they aren't the worst. You can definitely make ganks pre-6 work as Rengar, but his level 6 ganks are really, really good due to his ultimate because he can lane gank, which not a lot of other junglers in the game can do effectively. So as long as you can play Rengar correctly and get good ganks off at level 6, then he can be a strong pick for solo queue. Next I have Skarner. So Skarner, he hasn't been seeing like any play at all lately, but I still think that he is a pretty good pick for solo queue because he's got good ganks in the early game, his level 6 ganks are really good, and he also does scale pretty well into the late game. So if you are just looking for an overall solid jungler, then I would recommend Skarner. Next on the honorable mentions, I have Graves. So you're probably maybe a little bit surprised about this, but I think that Graves is actually a pretty solid jungler because he's got the knockback with his auto attacks, and it just allows him to stay pretty healthy in the jungle. And pretty much the reason that you're going to be picking Graves jungle is because you're going to want to have a Graves on your team. You're not going to be picking Graves jungle to have like an effective early game because his ganks really aren't that great. He's got a weak slow on his W. The reason why I would pick Graves is because your team is lacking some damage, or you just want to be able to carry pretty hard once you get to the mid to late game. If you're looking for a jungler who does have a strong early game presence though, and you want to be able to snowball the early game, then Graves probably isn't the best choice because his ganks aren't really good. But if your team is lacking damage, then Graves is definitely a pretty solid pick. Next up I have Mundo. So Mundo is just a really strong pick right now with the recent changes to the masteries, and I think that like he's one of the strongest tanks in the game, if not the strongest right now. He's pretty much unkillable once you get to the mid to late game just due to his ultimate, and due to like if you pick up a Spirit Visage on him, then he's going to be healing for so much with his ultimate. If you are playing against a Mundo, make sure that somebody on your team does take Ignite, or make sure that you end up building some grievous wounds against him, because if you don't, then he's literally going to be unkillable. But I think that he's actually got pretty solid ganks in the early game because of the pretty good slow on his Q. His clears also aren't that bad, and he does do a lot of damage for a tank. So if you're looking for a good tank jungler, then I would definitely recommend trying out Mundo. Next up I have Kayle. So Kayle is also really good with the Guinsoo's item. That item just synergizes really well with her because she, like Jax and Xin Zhao, does benefit both from the AD and the AP that the item gives, and she also does like a ton of damage once you get to the mid to late game as her. Her ultimate is really good as well, and her ganks like aren't the best, but they also aren't the worst. You could definitely pull off some effective ganks in the early game as Kayle because she does have the slow on her Q. But if you're looking for like a strong early game jungler, I would recommend someone like a Elise or a Rammus instead of Kayle because her ganks aren't the best. But the reason why you're playing Kayle is because you want a strong mid to late game, and Kayle definitely does provide that. Next, I have Amumu. So besides Mundo, I think that Amumu is one of the strongest tank junglers in the game. He's got a pretty simplistic kit. Like, all you want to do as Amumu is you want to bandage toss into a team fight and get an AoE ultimate off in pretty much every single team fight. That's what you're going to be looking to do. So he doesn't really have too hard of a kit to play. He's one of the easier junglers. Like, as long as you can land your Q as Amumu, then you can do really well with him. So if you're looking for another strong tank jungler with CC, then Amumu is a very viable pick. And to round out the honorable mentions for this patch, I have Vi. So Vi has a pretty strong early game. Her level 6 ganks are some of the best in the game as well. She's got like a pretty good mid game as well. She does fall off a little bit in the late game, especially if the enemies do start getting tanky, but as long as you can have a strong presence in the early to mid game as Vi, then you can be very successful on her. So that is all for the video, guys. If you did enjoy, then be sure to drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'm going to be working on the top lane list next, so that'll be out in hopefully the next few days. I'm going to be trying to get that out as soon as possible. So thanks for watching, guys. Have an awesome day, and I will see you in my next video.